On February 9, 2026, President Donald Trump issued a statement threatening to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Detroit, Michigan and Windsor, Ontario. This announcement came as the $6.4 billion infrastructure project neared completion after years of construction, with opening scheduled for early 2026. Trump's statement demanded that the United States receive full compensation for what he characterized as contributions to the project and suggested the United States should own at least one-half of this asset. The threat emerged within the broader context of U.S.-Canada trade tensions, including tariff disputes and negotiations regarding the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement scheduled for review in 2026. This situation raises questions about the intersection of international infrastructure agreements, domestic political pressures, and the mechanisms through which cross-border projects are governed when bilateral relations experience strain. This analysis examines the Gordie Howe Bridge dispute through several interconnected dimensions. First, we will establish the confirmed facts regarding the bridge's ownership structure, financing arrangements, and the legal agreements governing its construction and operation. Second, we will contextualize the project within the Detroit-Windsor trade corridors, economic significance, and the historical development of cross-border infrastructure. Third, we will assess the stated positions of relevant parties, including federal, state, and local officials, and evaluate the practical and legal constraints affecting implementation of the threatened action. Finally, we will consider implications for broader U.S.-Canada relations and the precedents this dispute might establish for international infrastructure cooperation. The Gordie Howe International Bridge project has been under development since the early 2000s when Canadian and Michigan officials identified the need for additional crossing capacity in the Detroit-Windsor corridor. After years of studies, negotiations, and regulatory approvals, Canada and the state of Michigan signed a formal agreement in 2012, establishing the framework for the bridge's construction and operation. This agreement, negotiated during Republican Governor Rick Snyder's administration in Michigan, established several key provisions that govern the project. The ownership structure divides the bridge equally between Canada and Michigan. Each party owns the portion of the bridge, approaches, and port of entry facilities on its respective territory. The Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority, a Canadian Crown corporation, serves as the project delivery entity responsible for construction, but ultimate ownership is shared between the two governmental entities. This structure differs from the claim in Trump's February 9 statement suggesting Canada owns both sides. The financing arrangement places the entire construction cost on Canada. The Canadian government committed to funding the estimated $5.70 to $6.4 billion project through Canadian taxpayer funds, with the understanding that these costs would be recouped through toll revenues after the bridge opens. This financing model emerged from political and fiscal realities in Michigan, where state budget constraints and public resistance to additional infrastructure spending made Michigan financing politically difficult. The 2012 agreement resolved this impasse by having Canada assume the financial burden in exchange for toll revenue rights until construction costs are recovered. The toll revenue structure establishes that Canada will collect all toll revenues initially to recoup its construction investment. Once the construction costs are fully recovered, toll revenues will be shared between Canada and Michigan according to the ownership split. This arrangement means Michigan gains a valuable asset without upfront capital expenditure, while Canada recoups its investment over time through tolls paid by users, including many American commercial vehicles that will benefit from reduced border crossing times. The legal framework governing the project includes multiple layers of agreements and regulatory approvals. The 2012 bilateral agreement between Canada and Michigan required approval from both federal governments, the Michigan legislature, and various regulatory agencies. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security formally designated the Gordie Howe International Bridge as an official port of entry on January 30, 2026, completing the regulatory process that allows the crossing to function for customs and immigration purposes. This designation represents federal government recognition of the bridge's official status within the U.S. border infrastructure network. Trump's February 2017 joint statement with then-Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau specifically endorsed the project. The statement declared, "Given our shared focus on infrastructure investments, we will encourage opportunities for companies in both countries to create jobs through those investments. In particular, we look forward to the expeditious completion of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. which will serve as a vital economic link between our two countries. This prior endorsement from Trump's first administration created the apparent inconsistency between his earlier position and the February 2026 threat. The economic context for the bridge centers on the Detroit-Windsor corridor, its role as one of North America's most critical trade crossings. Approximately 25% of all trade between the United States and Canada crosses this corridor, with particular concentration in automotive manufacturing supply chains. The existing Ambassador Bridge, a privately owned toll bridge operated by the Maroon family since 1979, handles the majority of current commercial traffic. The Detroit-Windsor Tunnel provides additional capacity for passenger vehicles, but cannot accommodate large commercial trucks. The need for additional capacity emerged from several factors. The Ambassador Bridge, while privately maintained, represents a single point of failure for supply chains dependent on just-in-time delivery systems where even brief delays create cascading disruptions. The bridge's location routes traffic through populated residential areas in both Detroit and Windsor, creating congestion and quality-of-life issues for nearby residents. The bridge's age, while structurally sound according to regular inspections, raises questions about long-term redundancy and resilience in critical infrastructure. The Gordie Howe Bridge addresses these concerns through modern design and strategic routing. The bridge connects directly to Interstate 75 on the U.S. side and Highway 401 on the Canadian side, bypassing populated areas and providing direct highway-to-highway connectivity. The modern port of entry facilities on both sides include expanded inspection capacity designed to process commercial traffic more efficiently than older facilities. The bridge's cable-stayed design with an 853-meter main span provides clearance for river traffic and represents contemporary engineering standards. Construction began in 2018 following completion of regulatory approvals and finalization of design specifications. The project involved extensive work on both sides of the border, including bridge construction, approach roads, customs plazas, and connections to existing highway networks. As of February 2026, construction is essentially complete with final testing and inspection underway. The absence of a formal opening date reflects standard practice where complex infrastructure undergoes comprehensive systems testing before being declared operational. The immediate response to Trump's February 9 threat came from multiple directions. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer issued a statement emphasizing that the bridge is jointly owned by Michigan and Canada, not solely by Canada as Trump's statement suggested. Whitmer characterized the threat as potentially damaging to Michigan's economy given the state's dependence on Canadian trade. Michigan's Democratic U.S. Senators Debbie Stabenow and Gary Peters issued similar statements warning that blocking the bridge would harm Michigan businesses and workers. Former Michigan Republican Governor Rick Snyder, who negotiated the 2012 agreement, wrote an op-ed in the Detroit News explaining the ownership structure and warning that blocking the bridge would primarily benefit the Maroon family, which owns the competing Ambassador Bridge. Snyder argued that the public bridge was designed to break the Maroon monopoly on Detroit-Windsor crossings and provide competitive pricing for commercial users. Locking the public bridge would therefore preserve monopoly pricing power for the private bridge owner. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed the issue following a phone conversation with Trump on February 10. Carney stated the conversation was positive and that he explained to Trump the shared ownership structure. Carney expressed confidence the bridge would open as planned, characterizing the dispute as resolvable through clarification of the existing agreements. Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkins called Trump's threat insane and emphasized that Canada funded the project as a gift to North American supply chains that comes at no cost to American taxpayers. The White House press secretary's February 10 briefing provided the administration's rationale. She stated that the president found it unacceptable that Canada would control what crosses the bridge and owns land on both sides. She also cited concerns that insufficient American-made materials were used in construction. These concerns relate to Buy American provisions that typically govern U.S. government-funded infrastructure projects. However, since Canada funded the project entirely, Buy American requirements did not apply in the same manner as for U.S.-funded projects. The legal mechanisms available to block the bridge's opening are limited and would face significant challenges. The bridge is on track to open because it has received all necessary regulatory approvals from both countries. The Department of Homeland Security's January 30, 2026, designation as an official port of entry completed the federal approval process. Revoking this designation would require demonstrating that the bridge fails to meet safety, security, or operational standards, a difficult argument given that the bridge was built to modern specifications and has undergone extensive inspection. The shared ownership structure means that neither party can unilaterally make decisions affecting the bridge's operation without violating the bilateral agreement. Michigan's ownership interest creates a legal complication for any federal attempt to block opening, as the federal government would effectively be preventing a state from utilizing infrastructure in which the state has ownership rights. This raises federalism questions about the extent of federal authority over state-level infrastructure decisions. Trade agreement obligations under USMCA create additional constraints. Blocking completion of agreed infrastructure that facilitates trade between parties to the agreement could be interpreted as violating the agreement's provisions regarding maintaining open trade flows. Canada could potentially seek dispute resolution through USMCA mechanisms if U.S. actions prevented the bridge from operating despite meeting all technical and regulatory requirements. The Ambassador Bridge dimension adds a private interest element to the dispute. The Maroon family has opposed the Gordie Howe Bridge since its initial proposal, viewing it as direct competition that would reduce traffic and toll revenues on their privately owned crossing. The family spent over $33 million in 2012 funding a Michigan ballot initiative that would have required voter approval for any new international bridges or tunnels. Michigan voters rejected this proposal by a 59% to 41% margin, clearing the way for the project to proceed. Reports indicate that Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick met with Matty Maroon shortly before Trump's February 9 threat. Congressional Democrats sent a letter to Lutnick on February 11, requesting documents related to any communications between Maroon family representatives and Commerce Department or White House officials regarding the Gordie Howe Bridge. This timeline raised questions about whether private interests influenced the administration's position on public infrastructure. The trade war context frames the bridge dispute as one element in broader U.S.-Canada tensions. Trump administration tariffs on Canadian goods, Canadian retaliatory tariffs on American products, and disputes over various bilateral issues have created an atmosphere where infrastructure cooperation becomes entangled with trade negotiations. The timing of the bridge threat coincides with upcoming USMCA review processes and negotiations over various bilateral economic issues. The precedent implications extend beyond this specific bridge. International infrastructure projects typically rely on long-term agreements that provide predictability for planning and financing. If such agreements can be reopened or challenged based on political tensions unrelated to the infrastructure project itself, it creates uncertainty that could affect future cross-border cooperation. Private investors and government partners need confidence that completed agreements will be honored even when broader bilateral relations experience difficulty. 3 scenarios emerge from analysis of this situation. The first scenario involves resolution through clarification and reaffirmation of existing agreements. This scenario assumes that Trump's threat reflected incomplete information about ownership structure and financing arrangements, and that clarification of these facts through diplomatic channels would address the concerns raised. Canadian Prime Minister Carney's February 10 statement suggesting a positive conversation with Trump and confidence in resolution points toward this scenario. Conditions required include willingness of both parties to distinguish this infrastructure project from broader trade disputes, recognition that the existing legal framework already provides Michigan with substantial ownership interest, and political calculation that blocking the bridge would create more domestic political cost than benefit given opposition from Michigan state leadership and business community. Early indicators would include absence of concrete federal actions to prevent opening, continued systems testing proceeding toward operational readiness, and eventual announcement of opening date without additional conditions. Implications would be preservation of the bilateral infrastructure agreement framework, demonstration that existing legal structures can withstand political pressure, and opening of a bridge that provides economic benefits to both countries while reducing dependence on private monopoly crossing. The precedent would suggest that completed infrastructure agreements with strong legal foundations and bipartisan support can survive political transitions and bilateral tensions. The second scenario involves negotiated modifications where the United States seeks additional concessions related to the bridge in exchange for allowing opening. This could include demands for revenue sharing before construction costs are fully recouped, changes to operational control mechanisms, or linking bridge opening to broader trade agreement terms. Conditions would include Trump administration treating the bridge as negotiating leverage rather than as standalone infrastructure, Canadian willingness to discuss modifications to avoid indefinite delay, and Michigan state government acceptance of federal intervention in its infrastructure agreements. Early indicators would include formal negotiations announced between U.S. and Canadian officials, specifically addressing bridge terms, proposals for amended agreement language, and delay of opening pending resolution of negotiations. Implications would include establishment of precedent that completed infrastructure agreements can be renegotiated under political pressure. Potential complications for future cross-border projects due to uncertainty about agreement durability and strain on federal-state relations if federal government overrides state ownership interests for diplomatic leverage. The third scenario involves sustained confrontation where the bridge remains closed despite completion. This scenario requires the administration to find legal mechanisms to prevent opening despite existing approvals, willingness to absorb political costs from Michigan business community and state leadership opposition, and calculation that leverage gained in broader trade negotiations outweighs costs of preventing bridge operation. Conditions include legal findings that would justify revoking port of entry designation or imposing operational restrictions, Michigan state government either acquiescing to federal position or being overruled through federal authority, and Canadian response not escalating to broader retaliation that creates additional costs. Early indicators would be federal regulatory actions targeting the bridge specifically, legal challenges from either Michigan or Canada, an extended delay of opening beyond timeframes justified by technical considerations. Implications would include significant disruption to trade flows as existing crossings handle increased traffic without additional capacity, legal precedent for federal override of state infrastructure interests, damage to U.S. Canada bilateral relations extending beyond trade issues to infrastructure cooperation, and demonstration that private interests can influence public infrastructure decisions through political channels. This scenario faces significant practical obstacles given the legal, political, and economic costs it would impose. The Gordie Howe International Bridge dispute illustrates tensions between political rhetoric and infrastructure reality. The confirmed facts show the bridge is jointly owned by Canada and Michigan, with Canada financing construction costs to be recouped through toll revenues. Existing bilateral agreements from 2012, supported by Trump's own first administration in 2017, established the legal framework that has guided the project to near completion. Michigan state officials, business groups, and local leaders oppose blocking the bridge, viewing it as economically beneficial to the state and region. Three plausible scenarios range from clarification-based resolution, reaffirming existing agreements, to negotiated modifications seeking additional U.S. benefits, to sustained confrontation preventing opening. The first scenario appears most probable given the strength of existing legal agreements, Michigan's ownership interest, political costs of harming state economy, and limited federal legal mechanisms to prevent opening of infrastructure that meets all regulatory requirements. What remains uncertain is whether the threat represents a negotiating tactic that will resolve through diplomatic clarification, a genuine attempt to renegotiate completed agreements, or an opening position in broader trade negotiations where the bridge serves as one element of leverage. The outcome will depend on factors including priorities assigned by administration to this specific issue relative to broader U.S. Canada trade agenda, Michigan state government's willingness to defend its infrastructure interests against federal pressure, and Canadian response strategy balancing infrastructure cooperation against broader bilateral relationship considerations.